What's up, Covalence friends? Today we're going to be talking about page load. We're going to be talking about how it works. We're going to be talking about basically some of the inconsistencies and some of the things that can catch you up, as well as how to optimize. So make sure if you haven't subscribed, you hit that subscribe button below. If you haven't checked out our merch, check out the link to our merch in the description below as well. Otherwise, we're going to get right into it. All right, so we're starting off with our Express template. If you don't know what this is, it's just a repo that we have on our Covalence GitHub, and the link to this repo is in the description below. So go ahead, clone it, and you'll have all this code ready to use. And if you don't know how to clone, check out some of our stuff on Git and how to do this. But again, we're just going to be going through and kind of mimicking what a server would do in this situation. And so that's why we don't just have an index.html with a CSS file and a JavaScript file. But again, the repo is basically exactly how you would get it if you just cloned it fresh. I think I changed the title here just to kind of show that this is a page load example. And then I also changed the CSS file, and that's all I've done. Everything by default, this H1 is going to be green, and then the HTML is just, this code isn't even here, so it's just white by default, or whatever the browser does by default. And I just wanted to kind of showcase the green background. I wanted to make it very apparent when the page actually paints and loads. And so we changed the background color to be green, so it's obvious. And again, we're not going to be messing with the CSS anymore, so we'll go ahead and close that out. But this index.html, we're going to go ahead and kind of change it up, right? So when we actually request something from a server somewhere, so let's say we go to google.com, right? Or any homepage for that matter, we're requesting information from a server. Now your server parses the request, figures out what you're asking for, and then returns the appropriate content. Now in this case, most of the time for a homepage request, you're returning an index.html file. Now our browser receives this file and it starts parsing it in order, right? So it figures out it is HTML that we're dealing with, so then it knows what to do, and it looks at the head first. So it loads all this meta information, it loads the title, which is just kind of shown on the tab in your browser, and then it loads any links and any scripts too. So let's go ahead and we're going to put this script up here. So it's actually going to load this styles.css file, and what it does is actually just request this file from the server, right? And so it actually requests it from whatever this href is. And so with this, we're saying that we're requesting it from the exact same source. And so it's going back to the same server, and it's actually going to be looking for this, whatever is dictated by this path, right? Now, in this case, it's going to be a file that we're having in our public folder here, but the server itself is going to look at this path, and it's going to figure out what you're looking for, and it's going to return the appropriate thing. Now we're looking for a CSS file. The browser is going to get the CSS file, which takes time, and it's then going to parse the CSS file. So if you have a huge CSS file, if you're using multiple libraries, let's say you're using Bootstrap, Tailwind, all these different CSS files, it could take a decent amount of time because the browser actually has to parse the CSS file. It has to create some sort of data structure that it holds all the CSS classes and selectors in, and then it then is able to apply those styles to the body, right? And so that's why we want style sheets in the head, but we have to be very just cautious about how big our style sheets are. But we want to be able to apply these styles as the DOM is being parsed, right? So as the body is being parsed, we want to be able to apply the proper styles so that everything's painted at once, right? We don't want to paint things later on and cause things to kind of blip and look bad. And so the same goes for this JavaScript, right? The JavaScript file has to be requested. It's then returned, and then the browser then parses the JavaScript. And because JavaScript is an interpreted language, it takes quite a bit of time. It has to go through each line of JavaScript, figure out what you're doing. It has to load, all the code in memory, and it has to be ready to perform whatever you're doing. Now, if you were doing something like a loop, for instance, now in our case right now, we have just console.log express rocks. Now, if we wanted to do a loop, it's going to have to go through that entire loop before it even gets to the body. So let's go ahead and let's open up a terminal real quick, and we're going to do npm run dev, which is going to compile our TypeScript, which turns it into JavaScript. Hopefully you guys know what TypeScript is. If you don't, I highly encourage you look into it or check out some of our videos on TypeScript. But basically, it's just compiling this TypeScript into JavaScript, and it's going to make this file available so that we can actually get it, right? So let's go ahead. We're going to pop open our browser real quick. Let's open up the DevTools, and we're going to just do localhost 3000. And you can see that it loads essentially instantaneously, right? At least to our eyes, there's a little bit of a flash, but again, now that the page is up, you refresh and it's instantaneous, right? And so what I want to do is I'm actually going to go back, and we're going to change this a little bit. But I'm going back because I don't want the browser cache to keep the screen green, right? I want you to actually see the effects and how long that takes. So we're going to do a for loop. We're going to say let I equals 0. I is less than, let's say, 50,000. I think that should be good. And we're going to just console.log I. So it's actually going to go through, it's going to log, number 0 through 49,999 into the console. And that's all the code's doing for now, right? All right, so let's go ahead and pop this back open, and we're going to once again load localhost 3000. You can see after I hit enter, it's thinking, right? It's thinking, it doesn't know quite what to do yet. It keeps the former page, at least Chrome keeps the former page up before it's ready to actually paint the DOM. But you saw the spinner up there, and it did take a while. It didn't know what it was doing. It actually loaded, it logged all those numbers before it ever loaded the page, right? And so that's with, obviously the files being returned almost instantaneously, right? So you can see that right here, the styles.css, 5 milliseconds, the app.js, 7 milliseconds, indecipherable by humans. There's no way that we'd ever be able to tell with that amount of time. And so what we could do to make it even worse is that we could actually slow this down as well to slow 3G. And now we're going to also load localhost 3000. We can see that it's actually looking for styles.css and app.js. Took 2 seconds to load each one. Obviously, they're being loaded in parallel, so all the stuff in the head is loaded in parallel. Thankfully, it's not done one at a time. But still, it took 2.5 seconds to load that file before it could even start being parsed. And then it went through, did all the loop information, and then finally it got to the body and loaded the actual DOM, right? And so you can see how this could be really bad depending on what you put in your files and how big your files are. If you have a ton of JavaScript plus some kind of loop or something that's actually performing something before the page loads, you can really affect things and cause issues, right? So before it even gets to the body. Now let's go ahead and go back again. We're gonna take this throttle off real quick. And that's why by default, even with this repo, we usually put the script in the body. So we put it in the body at the end. So what it now is gonna do is gonna load the CSS, but now it's actually going to parse the body itself and then finally get to the script tag at the bottom, and then it's going to load the JavaScript. So we're going to keep this loop in there, but this time we're going to keep the script at the bottom in the body, and we're going to now load once again the localhost 3000. And you can see the actual page loads instantly before the numbers start being logged to the screen. So that's the benefit to putting your JavaScript in the body, right? Now you might be saying, what about DOM content loaded? DOM content loaded is another very good thing that we can do in our JavaScript, but the issue is, now I don't know if every browser does this, but I work a lot with Chrome, and I'm assuming a lot of people use Chrome, is that if we put the script in the head and we wrap this in an event listener and we do DOM content loaded, right, and then we put the loop in here, all right, so technically you're saying, all right, now DOM content loaded, the body should load. Well, yes, we will have access to the elements, but when we do this, the screen actually doesn't paint. And so the issue we're going to get here is that there's going to be basically no difference between having this DOM content loaded with the loop and not having the DOM content loaded with the loop, right? And so if I come back here, and we'll go and load the screen again, if I do localhost 3000, right, the screen doesn't actually paint. So you can see it did paint the background, which happens sometimes, not every time, right? So Chrome tries to optimize it, but it doesn't, right? And so the hello world never showed up until after all these were loaded, right? And so if we do this again, right, we can see the screen paints green, but hello world doesn't pop up until almost all of this is done. So there's some sort of order of operations here going with, with Chrome's backend code, or, its native code that is causing the screen not to paint even though the DOM content's loaded, right? So it does that whole loop before it ever actually paints this screen. So there's definitely some tricks you could try. I'd love for you guys to kind of test this out, maybe try and put some set timeouts in here, see how many set timeouts it would take before everything's painted. But there's always going to be a race condition, and so I highly encourage you, just if you can. Now there are use cases where you do want to run JavaScript up here, and then there's also cases where instead of actually requesting the file, you can just put the code directly in a script tag, right, like this, and you can actually just run all of your code directly in here, right? You could also do this in the body itself. So you don't have to request files from the server if you don't want, but again, it's pretty typical that you want it all in a separate file, because when you're actually working on this with other people, you want to be nice and not just put everything in the HTML. So don't try and write JavaScript in your HTML. But if you have to, like if it's like a one-liner, there are certain use cases where it is good just to put these script tags in the head itself without having to request a file, so that you're not requesting a bunch of files, because these heads and bodies can get ridiculously long, and if you're requesting too many things, it can really slow down your page load and cause some issues. So again, highly encourage you guys to kind of play around with this stuff to optimize page load and figure out the best way to actually go about loading stuff, and then split things up. If you have files that make sense in the body versus stuff that needs to run first, you can split it up as much as you want into as many JavaScript files as you can, or like I said before, remove some of the files, make them script tags. You can do the same thing with styles, right? Your styles can be up here. You don't have to request the file. But again, this is all taken into account, and you want as much HTML in the body itself, not created from JavaScript, right? Because again, we want to be able to parse that body and show something on the screen while this other stuff is loading. So while the JavaScript is loading, we can actually show the user something so that the user has no idea that that's even happening, right? So again, optimize your code, put your scripts in your body if you can. Again, there are certain things you can't, and you will create a much better experience for your users that loads instantly and is better for everybody. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope it all made sense. It's supposed to be really basic and for beginners, but it is a very important topic that a lot of people, even advanced developers, kind of forget about, right? And so you want to optimize that page load as much as you can. And again, this is mainly for websites that are requesting files, but JavaScript is interpreted everywhere. So even if you're writing like a Cordova app, you'll be able to instantly get that JavaScript file, but it still has to parse that file. And so whether or not the user actually sees the DOM immediately or not is dependent on where you're actually doing the parsing of the JavaScript. So again, optimize your code as best you can, make the experience as good as you can for your end users, and you're going to be happier all around. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below, and hopefully we'll be seeing you soon.